The following video covers the procedure for preparing an NMR sample for proton NMR. Let's begin by gathering all the materials that we'll need to prepare your sample. In order to make an NMR sample, you'll need an NMR tube, which will be issued to you. One of your microtest tubes is very handy to have. Naturally, you'll need your sample of organic molecules. We'll be using deuterochloroform as our solvent. Some folks find it helpful to have a small piece of whey paper to help transfer their powder, a microspatula, a transfer pipette, and some Kim wipes are always a good idea to have handy. Let's prepare the sample now. We'll begin by taking our sample and taking just a small amount of this out using our microspatula. Now in this case we only need a few dozen milligrams of material, so our balances are not sensitive enough to weigh this. Instead, we'll gauge it simply by looking at how much of the crystalline material is on the spatula. You'll need just about this much material. Once you have that material on your spatula tip, add it to the small test tube, and of course return any unused sample to the proper location. At this point we need to dissolve the sample in our lock solvent, which is deuterochloroform. So you'll be conducting this part of the procedure in the fume hood. We'll take 1 pipette volume worth of deuterochloroform and add this to our undissolved solid material. If your sample doesn't dissolve completely immediately, you may want to aspirate slightly using your pipette to agitate the solvent and solute and be sure that you have a nice clean solution that doesn't have any leftover undissolved solids. At this point, we're going to need to load that solution into our NMR tube. So remove the cap from the NMR tube and use your transfer pipette to transfer the solution you've just created into the NMR tube. Be very careful when you insert the pipette into the tube that you don't break the tip off, because if so it will fall inside and we'll have to retrieve it before proceeding. After this we replace the cap to the NMR tube and we're ready to check our depth of our sample using the depth gauge. It's important to be sure that we get the correct sample depth for a proper NMR analysis. So you'll want to hold your NMR sample up to the guide that's on the general lab bench in the middle of the lab. As long as the level of your solvent is above the minimum sample height line, you're ready to go. Finally, we need to label our sample so that our TAs can keep track of them. You'll do this using a fine point Sharpie. Simply take the fine point Sharpie and write your Georgetown net ID directly onto the top of the NMR tube. This will allow your TA to identify which sample is yours when they're loading it onto the instrument. Now your proton NMR sample is ready to be placed with the other samples from your section so that your TA can run the experiment when lab is over.